extraordinarily high, which keeps that prison labor population and that pool flowing in.
But yeah, thank you so much, Dan. So we have policing as a way of controlling people, as a way to protect the property, primarily of the rich, as a system that's not designed to help people necessarily so much as control people. And also, really important point, that policing can actually exist outside of police. It can exist in other systems as well. Really important points. Anyone else have any thoughts that come to mind about the definition of policing or the purpose of policing? I can read a few things that are in the chat as well. We have one comment that says it is a violent enforcement of control and targeted laws. We have another comment that says that policing is about controlling bodies, people who have been labeled as other in order to protect supremacist power. Another comment that policing protects property and controls people to keep people from breaking the law or perceived law. Another kind of note after that is, I mean, driving while black is a crime. Another says regulating and controlling the behavior of others. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now and go a little bit into what we're all here to talk about, which is the history of policing and how that connects specifically to us in Western Massachusetts, and even more specifically to the ongoing campaign right now to divest from policing and reinvest in community. That Northampton Abolition Now, the organization that we are representing, is involved in, and other organizations and people are also really invested in. So great answers to that question. And the main, most of the material that we're going through today comes from a great organization called Critical Resistance that has been led by Black folks who have been pushing to abolish policing and move to other systems that truly keep us safe. So one definition that they offer of policing that I think really resonates a lot with what a lot of you just said is that policing is a social relationship made up of a set of practices that are empowered by the state to enforce law and social control through the use of force. There's more in here, but I think that the idea of social control kind of came through really strongly in a lot of what you said. And I think that that is very much aligned with this definition. Another thing that kind of came up is enforcing laws and, or at least perceived laws, but with a lot of skepticism kind of expressed alongside that. Questions about which laws and who actually ends up getting policed. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit, again, using this resource set from Critical Resistance, about the history of policing, because I think that the history of policing is really important to understand, to see what the institution is designed to do, and to think about the limits of reforming it, and to understand why it's important to move towards shrinking the footprint of policing, and even more importantly, perhaps, to think about alternative systems that can really keep us safe. So a few kind of key moments in the history of policing that I think are really helpful to think about. So in 1680, South Carolina passed a law that allowed any white person to capture and punish a person running away from slavery. In other words, any white person could arrest any Black person. In 1690, a law was passed that actually required white people to act in this role. So before formal police, this was especially the case in the South, where white people were mandated by the state to serve as police units, really to enforce the institution of slavery. In the 1700s, Southern cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans formed paramilitary groups tasked with controlling and capturing enslaved people, with the goal of preventing and repressing rebellion. So slave patrols and militias often work together. In the US, these organized patrols are the first proper antecedents to modern police forces in the US South. And it's important to note the geographical and geopolitical distinctions between the North and the South. So the North around this time was starting to industrialize. And so you have industrial capital in the North, where policing played a slightly different function. Policing in the North played the function of enforcing the status quo of industrial capitalism, of controlling the growing urban workforce, and of quashing labor strikes when they would occur. So stopping people who were trying to organize for better wages and better working conditions. In the South, slavery was the predominant economic mode, and policing was developed there to maintain it and maintain its roots in racial capitalism. Also worth noting here, that in the American West, as the 18th century and especially into the 19th century, colonial police forces were made to maintain the settler frontier, and especially deployed against indigenous people who were being displaced continually from lands as the United States expanded westward. So in the early 1800s, laws were passed in several southern states requiring all Black people to carry passes and allowing for the arrest of any Black person without a pass, regardless of their status. So this is really important to understand policing in its early form as a way to control people's movements, which is something that's still very much true today and has been true at various really crucial moments in the history of organizing and activism too. So this is really relevant to us as we think about the present day. So I'm not keeping an eye on the chat, by the way. Sherilyn, if you want to maybe just like let me know by unmuting and jumping in if there's something in the chat that requires my attention, that would be awesome. So in the mid 1800s, we start to see police in the US coalesce into basically a uniform type. The previous antecedents like guards, watchmen, militias, and slave patrols began to coalesce into city-run 24-hour police. In New York City, that was in 1845, following Boston, which is one of the first municipal police forces that looks something like what we now understand and think of police forces as being. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that one of the things that I've been hearing recently and have been looking into recently is that when this specific history of policing in the US as being rooted in slave patrols and strike busting squads get brought up, another antecedent also gets brought up, which is the London Metropolitan Police. And it's true that in the United States, there is no one single source that inspired and served as a model for how policing ended up shaping up. But specifically with respect to the London Metropolitan Police, that too was actually an extension of a colonial force, right? So as people were displaced from land in England due to the enclosure movement and moved to urban areas, again, mostly to join industrial workforces. And this is crucial as colonization in Ireland grew, Irish people were considered subhuman by the British Empire. As Irish folks moved into London as well, due to displacement, due to famine, the London Metropolitan Police specifically developed tactics to control this population as well. So even to the extent that policing in the US has some other sources like the London Metropolitan Police, those two were about social control, about racial control, and about controlling urban workforces. So the pattern really remains the same. In 1885, in New Orleans, following a levee workers strike, the mayor suggested that police arrest any Black man who did not want to work, who was on strike. So this is a really direct and blatant enforcement of the norms of capital, disciplining those who revolt against capitalism with basically 24-hour police surveillance. And part of the reason I think this moment and this photo are so important is that it shows that it's not like police in the South controlled enslaved Black people and police in the North controlled white workers. No, in fact, the working class in the US has always been racialized. And after statutory slavery ended, as new institutions grew, including convict leasing, which is a way to keep Black people essentially enslaved by arresting them, criminalizing them, and forcing them to work, oftentimes for the very same planters who had just lost the Civil War. So too was policing used as a tool to control new, technically legally unenslaved workforces, Black workforces. So in the late 1800s, we started to see an increase in the organization of police. There was actually a decrease in so-called serious crime during this time, and part of that was because as populations moved around the US, as urban centers started to really grow, places like Chicago and the Rust Belt started to grow massively in population, we saw growing elite fears of working class rebellion as urbanization brought working class people in closer proximity to each other and to elite groups. So Christian Williams, who is an author who wrote on policing, said that the crisis of the time was not one of law, but one of order. Specifically, the order required by the new industrial economy and the religious moralism that supplied in large part its ideological expression. So the police provided a mechanism by which the power of the state and eventually that of the emerging ruling class could be brought to bear on the lives and habits of individual members of society. So that's the late 1800s. Further on, between 1890 and 1930, further changes happened. So this person pictured in the slide right here is August Vollmer, who was the first police captain in Berkeley, California. And he pushed police officers to act as social workers for the department, for social workers, and for the department to collaborate with social service agencies. So this kind of goes back to what Dan was talking about, how policing isn't just in the police, but also extends to other aspects of society. So we categorize this era as the progressive era of reforms. And I just want to say this, and I'll probably say it again, that really in the United States, the history of policing, especially since the Civil War, has been a history of reforms that really haven't worked to make a system that is not fundamentally racist. It hasn't ever gotten away from those roots. But the idea was that we needed to build kinder, gentler systems of reform and policing. So the city government had a lot of corruption, and reforms were implemented to try to address that perceived corruption. And the way they responded to that, the way that August Vollmer wanted to respond to that, and that had big ramifications across the country, was to make police more disciplined, more hierarchical, and more professionalized. So we start to see the probation and parole systems emerge at this time, and we start to see policing expand into different aspects of civil and social life. August Vollmer is considered the father of modern policing, and he really cultivated his vision of policing while participating in the US occupation of the Philippines. So this is really crucial too. At the turn of the century, the Spanish-American War happened, and the United States won that war and seized several colonies in the Caribbean and also in the Philippines. So the Philippines in particular became kind of a testing ground for police techniques and police technologies as part of a way to maintain access to resources and to suppress rebellions, crucially. So policing has always been subjected to reforms since this time, when those sorts of techniques were brought back to the US and deployed against agitated urban workforces. Lots of issues started to pop up that seemed to suggest a need for reform because of the kind of excesses of the system. But really the history of police has been one of reform, and Vollmer was a police reformer. His ostensible mission was to root out the gross corruption of American policing and replace it with professionalization, doing that with higher salaries, higher standards, more training, crime labs, and more technology. But really this mirrored the emergence of a more scientific form of colonialism around the world and of managing colonized populations. So for the US and the Philippines, that is where it really took on new life and new meaning. And they developed a whole set of professionalized technologies to prevent uprisings in the Philippines. They installed telegraph systems, two-way radios. They created card file systems, all of this really highly professionalized. And Vollmer took that and applied all that to domestic policing. So that's kind of the beginning of a lot more technology and a lot more professionalization to reform the police. All the while with lots of abuse, racialized harm, and still the enforcement of racist laws in the US. So during the same kind of time period, the early 20th century, the formation of police state forces started to blow up. So state police forces primarily took on the role of addressing union actions. So prior to this, in the 19th century, and very much still in the 20th century, maybe some of you have heard about the coal wars in Appalachia, but large corporations employed their own private forces. The Pinkertons, the Baldwin Felts agents, sort of infamous private strike-breaking squads that were employed by big companies, coal companies, et cetera, had been used, but they started to fall out of favor because they were so transparently not in the control of any civilian authorities, because they were so especially brutal, and they were seen by progressives of the time as being incompatible with their values. This was convenient also because corporations saw this as very expensive. They preferred that the state would actually just handle it for them. So a lot of state level policing emerged around this time as a solution to that, to address labor unrest without having to hire private guards as much. All right, so the 1940s onward. Here you have a picture of President Harry Truman. And when I was first learning about this through these resources, I was surprised to see Harry Truman's face on a slide about the history of policing. I didn't really realize that he had much to do with it. But so Harry Truman assumed the presidency in 1945. 2 years earlier, in 1943, there were 47 cities across the US that saw at least 242 riots, and that violence was largely started by white people against people of color. So this includes the Zoot riots in Los Angeles. It includes a number of other episodes of protracted racialized violence by white people against people of color in cities across the North, Chicago, Detroit, New York. All of these cities were seeing these types of incidents. And the police either took part directly in the violence or looked the other way. So Truman saw this as a moment to professionalize the police further. He saw, as sort of a liberal of the time, the problem of police violence as one of individual prejudice and individual discretion. So Truman's solution was more national oversight and training again. Liberal law and order was really his doctrine. And this meant millions of dollars being poured into local policing in years to come. Fundamentally, this was an effort to solve the problem of racism and violence within policing by pouring more money into it, more training into it. And this is something that we see strongly today when people talk about reforming the police, wanting more trainings, more technology, things that don't take resources away from the police, but actually invest more in it. So in a lot of ways, this really was the beginning of that. So the 1950s and really the 60s too, the backdrop was the Black Power movement and also kind of left-wing social justice, anti-war activism and organizing. So in 1956, we saw the creation of COINTELPRO, which was a secret FBI group monitoring and disrupting union, Black Power, and left-wing organizing for several decades. And they did this to great effect, disrupting a lot of organizations that were fighting for a more just world. The Black Panthers being a major target of these actions in particular. So in 1968, we see an omnibus law enforcement assistance administration under the US, what would become the DOJ, the DOJ implemented. And Truman's kind of bipartisan law and order tough on crime move that funneled millions of dollars into the local police was expanded by this. And again, the idea was to professionalize the police. This helped thousands of cops pay for college. It paid for technological innovation, a lot of which was used for surveillance. And it also implemented a lot of communication devices and other tech that ended up growing a lot over time. So very much connected to the anti-Black Power movement, anti-Black Power efforts by the state and efforts to break up other types of organizing that were happening. So in 1968, pictured here, you have a SWAT team. In 1968 was the first time that a SWAT team was deployed in Los Angeles. And I am gonna pause here and ask if anyone happens to know, or has a guess even, about what the first SWAT team was used to target. Who were they targeting? You can go ahead and just unmute and take a stab at it, or you can type your answer in the chat. So we have one guess, which is labor strikers. Any other guesses? Protesters is another guess that we have in the chat. Any other specific groups that you might come to mind? I see the Black Panthers in there. Yeah, so that's right. So the first usage of a SWAT team was against the Black Panther headquarters in Los Angeles. But interestingly, in nearby Delano, California, which was an agricultural town with farm workers, SWAT programs were piloted for the first time. And they were piloted in a different context. And the context there was indeed labor strikers, but particularly farm workers. So it was actually United Farm Workers, which is a multiracial coalition of Hispanic and Filipinx, actually, farmers who were organizing for better wages and, importantly, organizing for environmental justice. Even though that term didn't really exist at the time, one of the big things they were dealing with was exposure to pesticides. It's a really inspiring movement that had a huge impact on, I think, how we think about the world. It was connected to the free speech movement in California at the time and nationally. And SWAT tactics were actually developed first to suppress those movements and then very quickly deployed against the Black Panthers in Los Angeles in 1968. So the reason that this is so important is because this shows how policing was used not just to control people, not just to control labor, not just for racial control, but also to suppress organizing by anyone who wanted to push back and resist these systems. So in 1988, a policy called the STEP Act was passed, where you really start to see an uptick in gang policing, and also things that the state deemed as related. So this was a time when we saw harsher penalties for graffiti, as well as the sale of weapons. I skipped a couple of decades here, you might have noticed, and a lot happened in those decades. Richard Nixon did a lot to expand the criminalization of Black communities. The seeds of the drug war were really planted at this time as well, which is super important for the rise of mass incarceration, which I'll talk very briefly about later, even though we're focusing on policing right now. Incarceration really is the flip side of policing, especially in the last 50 years or so. So the 1990s started to see the expansion of schools developing their own police departments, or having police in schools. You begin to see the formalization of a separate police department in the 90s across school districts. So we start to see school police, school resource officers expanding during this time. And it's also worth noting something else that was happening in this period, so the 80s and the 90s. This is a period when we start to see profits for American corporations start to fall in the 70s due to global competition from places like Germany and Japan, where the US had actually invested really heavily. We start to see the imposition of a lot more austerity. So under Reagan, we see tax cuts for the wealthy, huge cuts to social services, many of which had been established in the New Deal in the 40s, and then also in the 60s under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. A lot of that starts to get rolled back. And so in order to address unemployment and more economic precarity, rather than building more social safety and more supports for people, criminalization was the answer. More police, more prisons. And we'll circle back to that in a second too, but all of that is very much connected. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed a crime bill into law that was sponsored and led largely by Joe Biden, the current president. And this poured $8.8 billion into law enforcement over 6 years for new technology, new programs, and it also created COPS, or community-oriented policing services. So there was a lot of big changes that happened here, reforms to policing. During this bill also passed the Three Strikes Law, which massively accelerated and made more draconian sentencing. It implemented a federal assault weapons ban and funded a lot more activity to crack down on street organizations. So more criminalization, more surveillance, a lot more money into policing, billions of dollars more into policing. In the 1990s to 2000s, we start to see community policing emerge as a model across the country. So this encouraged homeowners, business owners, business districts to unify their efforts together with the police in the streets. So we see an uptick in gentrification during this period, and it's not coincidental that those things were happening at the same time. In this photograph, you see the DARE program, or a DARE officer with school children. That's DARE, which means drug abuse resistance education. I personally was in the DARE program. I wonder how many people in the audience here themselves were in the DARE program. If you went to school since around this time, you probably had a cop come to school and talk about how drugs were bad and try to kind of foster this image that was really reinforced by a lot of media, by a lot of television, of officer friendly, the cop that is there to help you, which again, was super inconsistent with what policing actually did during this time. And as we've kind of seen, has always done. So in 2001, we see the US Patriot Act get passed after September 11th. The Department of Homeland Security created a whole bunch of grants that funneled still more money into local police departments. Anti-Muslim violence surged during this time. Arabs and Muslims during this time literally had a target on their backs, and the amount of federal funding and programs of federal and local law enforcement to target Arab and Muslim communities expanded the scope and power of police. And then that power that was built through the Patriot Act and through these DHS grants was used on a routine basis against Black people and against communities of color more broadly. If you've ever seen the show The Wire, you might remember a show that has a lot of issues, not boosting the show necessarily, but one of the things that happens, it's a show that is about the drug war in a lot of ways, but at one point, the cops in the show say that we can't get authorizations to go after street organizations. So let's just pretend that they have Muslim names. Let's give them Muslim names so we can get that Department of Homeland Security money. And this is a real thing that actually happened during this time. So in 2011, the Secure Communities program funded by the Department of Homeland Security gets launched. And this creates new partnerships, including shared databases between local and federal police. It also increased the capacity of ICE to efficiently deport immigrants. So over 1,200 jurisdictions in the post 9/11 period implemented this, and it allowed for a lot more cross-agency collaboration across independent jurisdictions and among different levels of government, while also increasing law enforcement collaboration with other countries. So where you really start to see, this is where you really start to see the rise of collaborations with the government of Israel. You start to see support for military police in the Philippines who collaborate with the BART police in the Bay Area, all sort of under the guise of the war on terror. In 2012, after the release of a report by the Malcolm X grassroots movement, which highlighted that a Black person is killed by police, private security, or vigilantes once every 28 hours, we see very little change. This report comes out, it doesn't get a lot of attention, and it only really entered the public sphere 2 years later during the Ferguson uprising, which brings us close to the present day. So the Black Lives Matter movement, as we kind of currently understand it, emerged in 2014 after a series of high-profile killings of Black people by police. So Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Eric Garner in New York, and many others. And Ferguson was really kind of the epicenter of a lot of national uprising at the time. And it also saw a huge militarized response while Obama was president to those protests. They literally brought tanks into Ferguson to shut down and quell this rebellion in response to police killings of Black people. And one thing that I think is worth noting about Ferguson is so Ferguson, Missouri is a predominantly Black community. And at the time of Michael Brown's killing, and Yaping, you can correct me on the numbers if you know them better than I do, but I believe 3/4 of people there had warrants out for their arrest. And I wonder if anyone has any idea as to why. How could 3/4 of a city have warrants out for their arrest? What were those warrants for? If anyone wants to drop in the chat or unmute and just take a stab at it, like what was that for? What were those warrants all for? Traffic stops from Sarah. Any other ideas? Unpaid fees for stuff, unpaid fines, minor tickets. Exactly. Administrative infractions, things like not mowing your grass, leaving your recycling bin in the wrong place. All of these things that basically criminalize poverty that initially start with a fine, but if you don't pay the fine, it gets escalated into bigger fines and ultimately criminal charges. And it was to the point that, again, 3/4 of the community had warrants out for their arrests. So what this goes to show is even as the high-profile killings of Black people by police were in the headlines, there was also this much more day-to-day harassment, surveillance, and criminalization of people, especially Black people, communities of color, and poor people by the police that was happening right there, right where all this was happening. And so last year, we saw a massive uprising for Black lives. In the wake of the killing of George Floyd, also Breonna Taylor, and many others, a new wave of Black Lives Matter protests swept the country. The Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of 50 organizations that emerged after the Black Lives Matter movement started, coalesced around the demand to defund the police. And we really started to see defunding the police emerge as kind of a consensus demand for how to address policing in this country. Given all this history that we've seen, given the roots of policing, which have always been about racist social control and economic control, which has always been about the protection of property over people. So the demand to defund the police came from an understanding of this history and also a recognition of the tremendous budgetary implications, how we spend our collective resources of this history. So these charts here show municipal budgets, excluding schools, because schools and education tend to be one of the biggest places that municipal governments spend money. But outside of schools, what you can see across these cities is that policing takes up a tremendous amount of our resources. We pour a ton of our collective funds into policing across cities. How big exactly that share is varies from place to place. This chart shows how it stacks up across cities. New York City at the top has a really big absolute number because New York is a big city of about $4.8 billion. But these orange circles on the right show what percentage of those general fund expenditures go into policing. And you can see that you have 25% in LA, almost 40% in Chicago, over 40% in Oakland, California. Huge numbers, 10, 20, 30, 40, almost half going into policing in big cities across the US. And this comes at a tremendous cost for other stuff that we might like to do. And it's another big motivation for that demand to defund the police, to divest from policing, and reinvest in communities. So this sort of shows the overall state and local spending on police over time. And what you can see is that starting around 1970, you start to see big increases in spending on policing. And violent crime rates still continue to increase with no real major changes, even as policing increases. But then, even as violent crime rates go down, policing still continues to go up and up and up and up in terms of budgetary spending. And rigorous assessments of where these numbers come from show that when you control for other factors, it's not policing that is behind the drop in violent crime or overall crime. In fact, communities that are policed are not safe. Communities that have resources are safe. So when you control for other factors, there's actually not really a correlation there. And a lot of it has to do with other stuff. So to kind of summarize and review a little bit what we've talked about, what is the function of policing? So racial control has been at the core of policing since the beginning in the United States. Another key function for policing has been the repression of dissent, and progressive and radical movements. Enforcing and maintaining capitalism has been a really big piece of that too. Protecting property and financial interests, a huge core mission of policing. And also controlling people's movement and access to resources, right? So that happens when gentrification increases, and so does policing in cities. We see it when ICE forms under the Bush administration and starts to collaborate with policing and also massively militarize anti-immigration. So just as other parts of the prison industrial complex don't constitute a broken system, so too does policing not represent a broken system. Oftentimes people will say that policing is broken. And I think what this history shows is that policing is not broken, but rather it is doing exactly what it is meant to do. We can't call for things that are going to try to make policing better. And throughout history, communities have tried and tried to fix and to improve policing, and it simply has not worked. Oversight and prosecution of cops cannot be supported if we can't undo it later. Community policing efforts like training and pairing cops with social services also don't work. That expands the scope of how much police do in a lot of ways. It puts them more in contact with people and puts them in a position to do more harm, not less. Okay. So I'm just going to do this really quickly. There's a lot of other resources from Critical Resistance. Again, that's the organization where all this is coming from on imprisonment. But I just want to say one quick thing about imprisonment, because it's really important as we talk about policing, not to forget about mass incarceration, which really is the other side of the coin here. And it's really all part of one system. But the origin of prisons in this country can, again, there's no singular genesis for it, just like with policing, there's many historical antecedents, but one really important one is 1829. A lot of people go back to this year when the Eastern State Penitentiary was built. And this is referred to as the first modern day prison in the United States in Philadelphia. And part of the rationale for building the prison was because it would be a bit of a departure from the old model. There were so many other practices of imprisonment. Some go back to the Walnut Street Jail as a pivotal moment, the debtors' prisons in England also. But Eastern State Penitentiary was seen and advocated for as a reform. People saw the old model as something that was referred to then as a barbarous system of punishment. So very similar to thinking about slavery and reforms to attempt to keep Black people under control, Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania was a reform. So the history of imprisonment also started with a reform. The point was to focus on rehabilitation, and the word penitentiary actually comes from penitence or repentance. It was advocated for by the Quakers, among others, to allow for people locked up in these spaces to reflect, to repent, to have time to think about what they did and reform themselves so they could come back into society and be better citizens. As soon as it was built, the Quakers primarily realized that it was a mistake. And so ever since then, the Quakers have been on the front line advocating for the abolition of imprisonment. In a lot of ways, it was too little too late when this was built because this became kind of a model for incarceration. But I think that's a really interesting piece of history as well. In 1971, obviously this is a big jump in time, and there's a lot more about the history of incarceration. But this is the Attica Uprising. And this quote is taken straight from the Manifesto of Demands that the prisoners wrote out. And they said, "We are men, we are not beasts, and do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. The entire prison populace has set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States." So the Black Panthers emerged in support, came out in strong support of the incarcerated people, but the protest ended in the massacre of prisoners by state police called in to quell the rebellion. This is a pivotal moment because, again, thinking about the dates and what was happening during this time period, we can see how this is all part of a system that was designed and deployed to quell threatening organizing, led by Black folks in particular, against truly unjust systems. So another thing to note about incarceration is that state policy really drives incarceration. And it's at the state level that a lot of policy that makes incarceration happen gets made. So when we think about incarceration, state policy is really, really crucial. One other graph I just want to show. So if you remember this sort of chart about the rise of policing going up and up and up and up, another chart shows incarceration growing massively at that time. And as many of you might know, the United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other country on the planet. There are millions of people who are in jails and prisons in the United States, and those people are hugely disproportionately Black, people of color, and poor people. There's also a lot of white people who are incarcerated, especially a lot of poor white people. So this system harms all kinds of groups, and it is also centrally an anti-Black system. So a great book that I highly recommend is Golden Gulag by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And what she really lays out in this book that is so powerful, I think, is that the rise in incarceration, in mass incarceration, starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s through today, is really the flip side of austerity, of what some people call neoliberalism. So in the 80s, as again, funding for social services was cut, as unemployment rose, as finance capitalism on Wall Street started to take off because profits were no longer available from kind of industrial investments in the US, all of the money that the elites had to find somewhere to invest. And that somewhere ended up being a lot of complicated securities, the same kinds that ultimately would cause the Great Recession of 2008. So as people were moving off of land because agriculture was getting more intensive, as people were increasingly unemployed because the economy was seeing falling profits and less investment, as the welfare state eroded and the state kind of had less to do, rather than investing in systems that made us all safer and cared for us in healthcare, in education, et cetera, the solution that a lot of leaders came up with was building more prisons. They could solve all these problems by building prisons on land, creating jobs in rural communities, controlling an unemployed labor force that was disproportionately Black again by criminalizing people and putting them in prison. And it also gave somewhere for all of this kind of finance capital to sink into as an investment. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on that, but if you're interested in that kind of idea, Ruth Wilson Gilmore really lays it out tremendously effectively. Okay, so I think I'm going to move ahead a little bit quicker right now and skip this for now. This is just showing just the amount of money, again, that is spent on mass incarceration. And I'm going to move ahead to talk a little bit about Northampton. So you might think, okay, this is interesting history, but this sounds like a lot of it was a long time ago. And a lot of the big uprisings and high profile police killings that we see today are in big cities. Do these trends apply today? And do they apply in Northampton? And our answer to that question is yes. And a couple big sources of information that we have to answer this question are one, the Northampton Policing Review Commission report, which was a commission that was formed last summer. There's at least one member of that commission in this session right now with us, and they did a tremendous amount of work surfacing local data and testimonials about how the Northampton police are not an exception to this, but are part of it. And I'm not going to be able to go into all of that data right now, but just a couple things. I do have testimonials with me that I could share later if people are interested, but a couple examples. So in 2019, the Northampton police used force on 6 people under the age of 18, including a 10-year-old. 3 out of those 6 youth were Black. Also in Northampton, we've seen budgetary trends match exactly or match really closely national trends. So in this graph, you see the blue line is police, and you can see it going up and up and up and up and up a lot quicker than other municipal departments. So human services, arts and culture, public works may have grown a little bit, but they've been super flat compared to policing. So even as in Northampton, there's been no identifiable reason to invest more in policing, that's exactly what the community has done. Another way to visualize this is to look at the police budget in absolute terms versus some of these other things. So the library, veterans services, the Board of Health, Recreation, and the Arts Council. Hugely low funding compared to the police. And you can see that kind of visually on the right a different way as well. I like to paraphrase Martin Luther King, who said a budget is not just an allocation of resources, but a moral document that tells us what our values are as a community, and perhaps even more importantly, who we center in decision-making. And I am someone who's very concerned about climate change and climate justice, and I particularly think a lot, not only about how we could invest better in systems that take care of people going through crisis, but also the resources that we could use that are now poured into policing to decarbonize our economies, to address climate change and promote environmental justice. In Northampton, of the top 100 employees, top paid 100 employees, 34 are police. Another pretty shocking statistic. And in Northampton, like elsewhere in the country, police don't really do what they say they do. A tiny minority of calls that they field address what is considered to be violent crime. The vast majority of police time is spent on other stuff. So this raises a question. Who are the Northampton police aiming to create safety for, and at whose expense? So Jody Casper, the chief of police, said that they routinely do drive-throughs on a lot of places, and some people like to see an officer drive through their neighborhood because it offers a sense of safety. But residents of Northampton's Hampshire Heights, which is a place where a lot of working class people live, said that the neighborhood is no stranger to visits from the police. One resident said, "I don't think you're going to get much positive response from the police here." When asked if the police come through a lot, this person looked at their watch and said, "Is it 8 o'clock yet?" Another resident said that to the police, "Everyone here is an aggressor. They make me feel uncomfortable. I'm more scared of them than I am walking down the street in Springfield." Also worth noting that the majority of arrests in Northampton, according to the former chief, 66% are people who are not Northampton residents. 19% of those arrested in Northampton identify as homeless or transient. So again, who is actually getting criminalized, and could we actually invest in care for everyone who needs it instead of policing? So just a few thoughts there. Now, Northampton Abolition Now has 3 demands that we can talk about that are derived from national organizations like the Movement for Black Lives, Critical Resistance, Black-led organizations that are calling for this stuff. The first one is to reallocate immediately the $880,000 that Northampton cut from its police department last year as a result of really sustained organizing by lots of people into things that really keep us safe under the leadership of those who have been most harmed by policing. Second, to establish a new Department of Community Care outside of the police and led by people who have been most impacted by policing. This is a core recommendation of the Northampton Policing Review Commission's report that was really well researched and again mirrors stuff that's happening around the country. And finally, to in this fiscal year, fund that department and defund the Northampton Police by 50%, reallocating those resources to programs that really keep us safe, including peer-led, non-police mobile crisis response systems that can address harm where it occurs in our community. Again, a thing that lots of other cities are doing that we have increasingly more precedents for that we can look to when we think about how to implement this. The good news is that we are not alone in this. Around the country, cities are making moves to divest from policing, reinvest in community, and reimagine community safety. In Berkeley, they approved the goal to cut the police budget by 50%, take cops out of traffic enforcement, and invest in alternatives, for example. In Seattle, key organizations called to cut the budget by 50%. And as a result of that, 7 out of 9 Seattle city councilors at one point committed to defunding the Seattle Police Department by 50%. And when that demand was made really strongly by people, ultimately an interim move was made to cut the department by 18% and invest a lot of that money in Black-led organizations and other funds in municipal Green New Deal programs focused again on climate justice. So the possibilities here are really tremendous. In Austin, Texas, again, organizations called for an immediate 50% cut to the department, and ultimately the city council was pressured to cut their budget by $150 million. And a lot of that they invested in housing for unhoused people, which was especially important in the context of COVID and the economic impacts that had on so many people. Oakland, California is another place that is making big moves in this direction with a formal commitment to pursue and explore exactly how to make these really big changes. There's other really great examples that we can get into, but I think I can leave it there right now. It's 6:54 and we have time for questions and discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you all so much. All right, so Sherilyn and Yaping, we have about, I see 29 participants here. Do you think that we should go to breakout groups or do you think that we should stay in the big group? Do either of you have thoughts on that? We figured that we'd kind of assess how many people were here before figuring out exactly how to structure this next segment. Yaping, do you want to weigh in?
I wonder if we can take a quick poll, but do people know how to do the thumbs up or thumbs down? And we could do, if you want to do breakout rooms, so it would be about 10 of us per, or wait, no, yeah, about 10 of us per breakout room, or if you want to stay in the big. So thumbs up if you think a breakout group where we could have some smaller discussion would be fun, and thumbs down if you don't want that. Do people know? You go into reactions and then, okay, I see some no's. Yeah, oh wow, it's really half and a lot of no's. So maybe we can just stay in the big group. Yeah.
Let's stay in the big group and being conscious of people's time too. If people can stay on a little bit longer and want to talk more, we can continue to have more smaller group conversations too. But yeah, I'm gonna, yeah, why don't we just open it up to questions? And if people want to, I think maybe the best way to do it is if people want to use the raise hand feature, we can keep track. But yeah, questions or comments and, feelings, reactions, doubts, anything you want to share, I think would be super interesting to all of us. Yaping, your hand is up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you could talk, I think in the graph that showed the police spending over time, the prison spending over time, about the historical context of why the spending increased exponentially in around 1968 and 1970. Or maybe if someone else knows. Or I know the answer, but I think it's an important point and important to talk about.
I wasn't expecting a follow-up quiz, so why don't you just tell us the answer?
Well, I'll see if anyone else wants to chime in first.
Okay.
So the question is, in those graphs where it showed police spending and crime rates eventually just evening out, why the police spending and why the prison spending went up so much around 1970. Yeah, I'm seeing, answers in the chat.
In the chat, people are saying protests, war on drugs.
Yeah, and then any other sort of a lot, and in addition to war protests, I think that's part of the civil rights movement. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Just 1968 and Black Panthers and lots of other movement and organizing work that was happening. So, yeah, I think that's a really key thing to think about, what really sparked increased police and prison spending.
Jose, I saw you had a hand up a minute ago.
I I just wanted to say thanks for covering the full timeline of all the times that people have tried to invest in policing, because I didn't know actually how many times and money has been wasted on that.
Yeah, that history of policing being a history of reform, I think, is really good for us to remember. There's a question in the chat from Linda, which is, what happens to police who lose their jobs with cuts to the police department? Does anyone want to try to, anyone have any thoughts on that question? It's a question that I've definitely spent time thinking about myself, but spoilers, I don't have the definitive answer to that, but anyone want to?
I mean, I think it'd be cool if as a community, we could find ways to like provide, you know, assistance to them as they transition to another field. Like, I think that would probably be the most, you know, the kindest way to, you know, but I don't have, you know, I know that people don't really talk about it that much.
One answer in the chat is pay cuts. Again, as we saw in Northampton, for example, you know, 34 of the top 100 salaried positions are cops. So there's one answer there. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because, and I, you know, last summer I was thinking about this a lot because we do need sort of compassionate ways to take care of everyone. And I think one thing that is really important to remember is that, and this is something that Miriam Kaba says a lot, is that Miriam Kaba is a leading Black abolitionist organizer. And one thing that she says is that I wouldn't want to just delete the police from the world. I'm paraphrasing, delete the police from the world and leave everything else the same, right? No one would really want that. At every step, we want to be building systems that are better and different, that really take care of people. And to me, the big vision includes a Green New Deal. It includes job programs for everybody. It includes healthcare for everybody. It includes building a world, a society that takes care of everyone, so that there's all kinds of new and better things that we reward broadly the work that we actually want done, that actually makes us safer, makes us healthier, makes us live better and richer lives. And ideally, when we start to invest in our communities in that way, opportunities for everybody will open up. I can't say that finding new jobs for current cops is the top priority in my head right now, given that there's so many other needs that we need to fulfill. But ultimately, the vision is to provide for everyone in our society without exception. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts on that. In the chat, there's a couple of thoughts here. So one from Dan. And by the way, Dan, if you want to share, you can go ahead, or I can just read what you said. Okay, so what Dan said. Oh yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so it really does depend. In some cities where there's been defunding, even though it hasn't necessarily related, it hasn't necessarily caused a reduction in the police force. So thinking about like Austin and things like that, there are officers who do resign or they retire early. They just want to move on. So that happens. In others, it really does depend about the time. Like that's a big part of it, because if you give people enough time to prepare, they can make nice informed decisions about their own lives. They could go for retraining. They could look at employment in the city in other positions, in other departments. They could work to become trained peer responders. So they could go or peer unarmed responders, not necessarily peer, but they could work towards that. They could take those positions, but it really does depend on what they want to actually do. It's just like in any other in any other workforce where you experience, a cut because of how that industry is working. So I think the same mechanisms are at play. So it's going to depend on what their education was, what their history's been, what their work interests are, and all of those things, and seeing how those align with what employment options there are.
Yeah, I think that's really good to keep in mind, that other sectors and other industries change, get restructured, get cut all the time, right? And we can find ways to shift our resources and priorities so that there are new opportunities in the world. Another question in the chat, another point on this that's in the chat, is that it's important to point out that the number of positions that are budgeted for in a department doesn't necessarily match with the number of employees within a department. That's right. So they often, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what that's saying is that, or if you just want to explain that yourself, that might be better.
Sure. So, more money is budgeted to a department than is needed necessarily right away. So it's budgeted based on the department head's full ideas for what full staffing in that department looks like. So just because that many positions have been budgeted for doesn't mean that that money is actually going towards anyone's salary.
And this also, I think, reflects another important point about municipal budgets, is that they are aspirational documents. They reflect what the city would like to spend. And they often appear to be staffing positions that aren't really filled. And that can actually make resources appear tighter than they are a lot of the time. So thank you for that addition. So another question in the chat is, what exactly would the community care department do in Northampton? Great question. Does anyone, Ping, or maybe even Dan, feel like taking on that one?
Yeah. So Department of Community Care, as it's been proposed by the Policing Review Commission, at first would really be responding to mental health, substance use, and issues of houselessness. So when somebody calls 911 or they call one of the business lines, that goes to the Public Safety Communication Center. They would do the triaging to find out the relevant information and then send that to the peer responders. Peer responders would then go out and from the Department of Community Care. And the goal there is that you have an unarmed response to that type of call. So they can offer support, they can offer assistance. They have a different approach, right? They're using a public health model of intervention rather than a policing model. So they're not going there with when people talk to them, no one's risking like their housing subsidies or things like that just by saying that there's drug use happening. Or if somebody used somewhere else but experiences the overdose in another person's home, that person doesn't have to worry about losing their assistance by calling for help, which is actually really important. The other things that this department could do, and that's expanding on it over time, they could start to respond. They could start to handle things like parades, marches, rallies, and the security for those things. They could start handling traffic enforcement. One of the important things to note is that about 50% of all police-related killings happen when they start as a traffic stop, and that's hugely important. So really taking those weapons out of all of those different scenarios, it could expand to pretty much any of the things that the police do. Really, you could have, for the most part, being done by unarmed peer responders. So the limit's pretty much the sky and what we determine that to be. We just need to make sure that there are policies in place for training and for safety for the people doing that job. I think other people can enter in things too.
Can people do a show of like maybe thumbs up, or let's see, the party hat, if you've already heard of Cahoots and heard of these non-police crisis response programs before. See if it's so a lot, but maybe not every, so we could, oh, okay, a lot of people, it seems like, are familiar with them, but maybe some folks not. So Cahoots has been up and running for 31 years. That has been an alternative response. And they have an EMT and someone who is a crisis responder, and 75% of Cahoots staff that are crisis responders identify as people with lived experience of also going through mental health crises. And then aside from Cahoots, there's a program in Olympia, Washington that's modeled off of Cahoots that's been up and running, I think, for about 2 years, and a program in Denver that's now been up and running for about a year. And then at least 21 other, or about 20 other cities, at least in the US and Canada, have started these programs or are in the process of piloting these programs since last summer. So, yeah, they're gaining a lot of popularity really quickly. And there's like proven track records that people that know how to just be there for someone, that works a lot better than, policing. And an important part of what Northampton Abolition Now is talking about in terms of the demand for the Department of Community Care is that the crisis response program is really peer-led and rooted in non-coercive approaches, which we're not actually saying just social workers should replace police, because social work oftentimes involves coercion and perpetuating racism and classism. So the programs that we're promoting would be ones that don't force people to do things and that really respect people's autonomy and approach people from a place of respect and compassion and not paternalism.
Thank you. So Lee, I hope that answers some of your question, but basically it could do a lot. Mobile crisis, non-police responses like Cahoots, and much more potentially too. I see a hand from Maritha, and then there's a question in the chat after that we'll get to.
Hi, everyone. So one of the things that that I'm wondering about, Amherst is putting in some restrictions like that. My mom is a therapist, and one of the two, I believe, three that are actually a Black woman and in this area. So the one thing that I'm trying to figure out is, while we are defunding the police and putting the monies other places, I as a teacher, I really feel like this information needs to go public or whatever. It needs to be put into the school curriculum. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the students that we have, the Black and brown students, don't have this information. And so as I look at this, and having had Officer Wallace removed from our school at JFK, going into whatever the year, and putting my Black body between cops and a student. So I do understand. I just think that other people don't. And the fact that there's 29 people here who have some knowledge of this, is really awesome. But really, this needs to start being, community wide in terms of canvassing neighborhoods, so that people actually really understand what we're trying to do. Because when you say defund the police, people get scared and they immediately shut down. And so I think there needs to be this, and as well as places where people learn how to, be with a neighbor their children are having a fight, or to help support. I do believe firmly in community support. And so I'm trying to figure out how we can take this information and move it forward, so that, whether or not people want to read it or not, we're putting it in their mailboxes on more than one occasion. And so I know that's a pain in the butt and may waste some trees, but I don't know how else to do it besides legwork. And I think about all the civil rights things that they did. It was all legwork, boots on the ground all the time, every time something happened. And that, to me, is really, really, really important, that we have boots on the ground, because I think something happens and then we're all reactive to it and we react to it. We're upset, we're angry, whatever. And then it kind of soothes back. And so I want to do more than just react. I want to have a plan of action. I mean, I saw 2 people pulled over yesterday. I was driving by and I pulled over because one of them was Black. And I think that should be like a given for people. But people don't know how to do that and keep themselves safe. They don't know their laws, their laws of protection about filming or whatever. So that's all I had to do. But I do think that information is really, really important because people don't always know. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yaping, do you want to say anything about canvassing and some of the plans that we have coming up?
Yeah, sure. So, wow, I totally agree with everything you just said, Maritha. And we are going to be door-to-door canvassing. And of course, in the most COVID safe ways possible, where all of the people that are canvassing, we're encouraging to wear double masks, and we would, knock on the door and then sort of run back very far. And we'll be going over ways to do this in a way that feel COVID safe and respectful to people. But we just had our first training last weekend, and then we're having another training and going canvassing this Saturday, starting at 11 a.m. We will meet on the side of Forbes Library. It's like across from the East Haven Spa, that part of the green outside. And so you can find out about the details about this on our Facebook page. We'll post an event probably later today, and on our website. And if on our website, there's an upcoming events page that we will also update later today. But if you sign up for our email list on the website under Get Involved or Take Action, there's an email list you can sign up for. And then if you follow us on Facebook and Instagram, we also post updates, but the email list is a very reliable place to get updates. Other ways to support this work, there are a lot, but I'll try to name a few. So our campaign with Northampton Abolition Now, the City Council will vote on the next year's budget around June 17th. And so we have, I think that's maybe like about 7 more weeks until then. And City Council has 4 more meetings. And so we're trying to get as many people as possible to come out to give public comment at the City Council meetings. Northampton, because it's such a regional hub, they seem to be good and okay with people who are not Northampton residents, but who have some connection to Northampton, whether that's, you have close friends or family there, or you go shopping there, or you work there, coming to public comment and making public comment, and also reaching out to city councilors about how you feel about moving beyond policing. So coming to these city council meetings is extremely helpful. And we really need more people coming. I don't know if someone can drop in the chat the link for our sign up for city council public comments so that we can send you a text the day of with a reminder and a link to the suggested talking points. Also this Wednesday from 6 to 7, we're holding a city council public comment training. You don't need to do that to come do public comment, but that's there if you want the extra support. And we generally table on the weekends, and we'll post information on our Facebook and on the email list about that. And basically we welcome volunteers to join us in any of these things. And we would also we're all volunteers, obviously. So if anyone else is interested in volunteering in any capacity, we would welcome support in whatever arena is an area that you would enjoy volunteering in.
Do you have specific plans for tabling this weekend that you can share?
We're working those out, but we'll post them on Facebook and send them out over the email list. Yeah.
Also, just specifically to your point about like being a teacher and wanting like kids in your classrooms, I feel like it would be really cool if like you or other JFK teachers wanted to like have some sort of like a similar presentation in your classrooms. I don't know how that would logistically work, but I think it would be really cool. As someone who went through the NPS system, I've had teachers who, when they do stuff like that, it was really helpful.
Just so you know, I write the Black History curriculum for JFK now, and it is definitely in there. not that I don't know if it actually sinks in, but it is in there, this information. And I teachers at JFK will say things like, I don't know how to teach this, it's too hard, and so they won't. And that okay, but that's about is yes, I'm not gonna say anything wrong about my colleagues. However, it is a point of contention.
Well, thank you for writing that curriculum. And if there's anything we can do to, or as like a former NPS student who may have been in those classrooms, let me know if there's anything I can do.
Will do.
Anyone else have any questions or thoughts, or I don't know, creating educational pamphlets that include information you presented here with data and graphs and info on the models. Awesome. So we've got a couple pamphlets, but we could probably use some more. Yeah, Ping, do we have digital versions of those pamphlets that we created, or?
Yes, I'm gonna try to drop it in the chat, but if not, we can email it out if we have people's contact.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, Ping, can you let me know when those trainings are?
The canvassing one?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. As of now, the next one is this Saturday at 11 a.m. outside of Forbes, but I'll also send out a link with because there's a breakdown in terms of, we'll have the training from 11 to 12, lunch break 12 to 1, something like, I actually forget the lunch break and the camp. I think it's lunch break 12 to 1 and canvas 1 to 3. And then because this Saturday is May Day, we're also gonna optional like debrief and hang out on the lawn afterwards. Yeah. But I'll send it out too.
Thank you.
Is there an imagined and realistic timeline for the desired changes? So I think I can take a stab at that. So we are campaigning with the intention of getting a lot of this stuff done right now, this coming fiscal year. And the reason for that is because the Mayor Narkowitz, will be presenting his proposed budget to the City Council on May 18th, right? 17th, 18th? 18th. So that's going to be a crucial kind of date. So between now and then, we're really trying to target pressure towards the mayor specifically to release a budget that reflects these demands, that takes money out of policing and puts it into alternatives and creates that Department of Community Care. So the demand is to create that Department of Community Care right now. We're also working with city councilors to get their support for this. And there's a few ways that can look. It can look like them pressuring the mayor. It can look like them adjusting whatever budget he releases to move closer to the vision that we're talking about here. But those are sort of the short-term timelines. After that, we'll have to see what happens. But no matter what happens, even if all of these demands are met, the work is not over. There's still so much more to do to reimagine community safety, to invest in the right things, and to make sure that people who have been most harmed by policing are in leadership around this process of completely reimagining what community safety looks like. So yeah, I mean, another key date that I want to plug, Yaping may have mentioned this, but May 6th is the next city council meeting. And we really want public comment to turn out big that day. Public comment makes a big difference. We've heard from city councilors that when lots of people show up and say, speaking from their own experience and speaking from what they know, a really strong message, it makes a big difference. So to come out and say that we want a Department of Community Care, that we want a 50% cut to the police budget, and we want to see peer-led alternatives to policing under the leadership of those who have been impacted by policing, that can make a really big impact. So again, tinyurl.com/comment crew. I'll drop the link in the chat again to stay up to date on exactly how to plug in there is another really kind of immediate step that we can all take.
curious if there are any more questions about approach or goals, or especially maybe with regards to other like goals that have been put forth by groups around reform. I'm seeing a question in the chat. Do you have an amount of funding you are demanding for the community care program out of the 50% police department cut? Ashwin, do you want to?
Right. So broadly speaking, we want funds that are taken out of policing to be reallocated to stuff that makes our community safer. The Department of Community Care is envisioned as one of the main vehicles to make that happen, although not necessarily the only one. The crucial thing is that people who have been most impacted by policing be making decisions about what we fund instead of the police. But one thing that we want to be clear on is that we want money to be reallocated towards people. Last summer, when they cut the Northampton Police Department budget by 10%, Mayor Narkowitz refused to reallocate any of that money, that $880,000, to anything, and it just kind of went to the general fund without democratic oversight or accountability to the people who had been harmed by policing about where that went. And we do not want that to happen again. We want money that is taken out of policing to be reallocated under the leadership of those who have been impacted by policing. I think that's the main kind of principle. Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, I guess those of us who are involved directly in NAN can hang out for a little bit. Those of us who can, and if people want to hang out and chat a little bit more, you're welcome to. I don't know. What Yaping, Sherilyn, do you think that sounds good to kind of end the slightly more formal bit of this event right now and hang out to chat afterwards?
That sounds good to me. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming by and for hanging out with us a little bit this evening, and really hope to be in touch with you all going forward about this really exciting opportunity that we have in Northampton.